The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning London's streets into a blur of reflected neon and slick pavement. Ethan Carter tightened his grip on the handle of his umbrella, his trench coat soaked through despite his best efforts. The city was alive with the hum of traffic and the distant wail of sirens, but Ethan felt none of its energy. He was a man adrift, his life unraveling at the seams. At 38, Ethan had built a career as a journalist specializing in debunking pseudoscience and paranormal claims. His articles were sharp, incisive, and often scathing, earning him a reputation as a skeptic who didn't suffer fools gladly. But lately his work felt hollow, a distraction from the growing void in his personal life. His marriage to Claire was crumbling, their once vibrant connection reduced to terse conversations and awkward silences. And then there was his father's death, a loss that had left him feeling untethered, as if the anchor of his life had been ripped away. Tonight, Ethan was on his way to meet a source for what he considered another frivolous assignment. A series of near-death experience accounts from patients at St. Mary's Hospital. The stories were all the same: bright lights, out-of-body experiences, encounters with deceased loved ones. Ethan had dismissed them as hallucinations, the brain's desperate attempt to cope with trauma. But his editor had insisted, "People eat this stuff up, Ethan. Just give it a shot." As he crossed the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Claire. Again. He hesitated, then ignored the call. He couldn't face another argument, not tonight. The traffic light turned green, and Ethan stepped into the crosswalk, his mind still churning over the ND accounts. What if there was something to them? What if? The screech of tires shattered the night. Ethan turned, his heart lurching as a double-decker bus barreled toward him, its headlights blinding in the rain. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the roar of the engine, the scream of the brakes, the panicked faces of the pedestrians around him. And then impact. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and sensation. Metal crunched against bone, glass shattered, and Ethan felt himself lifted off the ground, weightless for a moment before slamming back down onto the wet pavement. Pain radiated through his body, sharp and all-consuming, but it was distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He tried to move, to cry out, but his body wouldn't obey. His vision blurred, the rain and the streetlights merging into a kaleidoscope of color. He could hear voices, muffled and frantic, but they seemed to come from far away. And then something strange happened. The pain faded, replaced by a strange, floating sensation. Ethan opened his eyes, or thought he did, and found himself looking down at the scene below. His body lay crumpled on the ground, surrounded by a growing pool of blood. A crowd had gathered, their faces pale and horrified. A woman screamed for someone to call an ambulance, while a man in a suit knelt beside Ethan's body, checking for a pulse. Ethan tried to speak, to tell them he was right here, but no sound came out. He reached out, but his hand passed through the man's shoulder as if he were made of smoke. Panic surged through him, but it was a distant, detached kind of panic, like watching a movie of someone else's life. The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon the street was filled with flashing lights. Paramedics rushed to his body, their movements quick and efficient. Ethan watched as they loaded him onto a stretcher, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a trick of his dying brain. But it felt real. Too real. The paramedics worked frantically, their voices tense and urgent. "We're losing him," one of them shouted, and Ethan felt a strange pull, like a current dragging him away from the scene. He fought against it, but it was no use. The world around him dissolved into darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then light. It started as a faint glow in the distance, warm and inviting. Ethan felt himself drawn toward it, the fear and confusion melting away as he moved closer. The light grew brighter, filling his vision, and with it came a sense of peace unlike anything he'd ever known. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the light began to fade. The darkness returned, and with it the sound of voices. "Stay with us, Ethan. Don't you dare give up." The words were faint, but they pulled him back, away from the light and into the pain and chaos of the world he'd left behind. Ethan's consciousness hovered above the operating table, a surreal vantage point that defied logic. Below him, his body lay motionless, surrounded by a team of surgeons whose faces were etched with concentration. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a steady reminder of the fragile thread holding him to life. "We're losing him again," one of the surgeons barked, her voice sharp with urgency. "Charge to 200 clear." Ethan watched as they shocked his chest, his body jerking unnaturally under their hands. He felt nothing, no pain, no fear, just a detached curiosity. He tried to speak, to tell them he was right there, but no sound came. It was as if he were a ghost, invisible and untouchable. And then the pulling began. It started as a faint tug, like a gentle current drawing him away from the operating room. At first, Ethan resisted, clinging to the familiarity of the scene below. But the force grew stronger, irresistible, and he felt himself being pulled into a swirling vortex of light. The world around him dissolved, replaced by a tunnel of shifting colors and patterns. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, walls of light that pulsed and shimmered as if alive. The tunnel seemed to stretch infinitely, its end hidden in a blinding glow. As he moved through the tunnel, time itself seemed to bend and warp. Flashes of his life flickered around him, vivid and unrelenting. He saw himself as a child, playing in the park with his father. The memory was warm, filled with laughter and the smell of freshly cut grass. But then it shifted, and he was standing at his father's funeral, the weight of grief crushing him. "I should have called more," Ethan whispered, though no one could hear him. "I should have been there." The tunnel showed him other moments, his wedding day, the joy on Claire's face as they exchanged vows, the fights that followed, the words he couldn't take back, the nights he spent buried in work, avoiding the growing distance between them. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to fix it." The tunnel seemed to respond, the light around him softening, as if offering comfort. But the journey wasn't over. Ethan was pulled deeper, into memories he had buried long ago. He saw himself as a young journalist, eager and idealistic, chasing stories that mattered. But over time the idealism had faded, replaced by cynicism and a need to prove himself right. He saw the people he had hurt along the way, sources he had exploited, colleagues he had undermined, friends he had pushed away. "I didn't mean to," he said, though the words felt hollow. I didn't know any other way." The tunnel shifted again, and this time Ethan saw moments he had never lived, choices he hadn't made, paths he hadn't taken. He saw himself as a father, holding a newborn baby in his arms. The love he felt in that moment was overwhelming, but it was tinged with sorrow. "That could have been me," he whispered, his heart aching. "That could have been us." The tunnel began to narrow, the light growing brighter. Ethan felt a sense of anticipation, mixed with fear. Where was he going? What awaited him at the end? And then suddenly he was there. The tunnel opened into a vast, surreal landscape. The ground beneath him was soft and shimmering, like walking on clouds. The sky above was a kaleidoscope of colors, shifting and blending in ways that defied description. In the distance he could see towering structures, buildings made of light, their spires reaching into the heavens. Ethan took a step forward, his feet sinking slightly into the ground. The air around him was warm and filled with a faint melodic hum, as if the very atmosphere were alive. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. "You are in the in-between," a voice replied. Ethan turned and saw a figure approaching him. It was humanoid but not quite human. Its form shimmered and shifted, as if made of light and energy. Its face was serene, its eyes filled with a depth of understanding that made Ethan feel both comforted and exposed. "The in-between?" Ethan repeated, his mind struggling to process the words. "A place where souls transition," the figure said. "A place of reflection and preparation." Ethan looked around, his heart pounding. "Am I dead?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "Death is not as simple as you think. Your body clings to life, but your soul has journeyed here. This is a space between worlds, a place where you can see clearly." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Why am I here? What am I supposed to do?" The figure extended a hand, or something like a hand, toward him. "You are here to understand, to see the truth of your life, and to prepare for what comes next." Ethan hesitated, then reached out. As his hand touched the figure's, a wave of energy surged through him, filling him with a sense of calm and clarity. "Come," the figure said. "There is much for you to see." Ethan followed, his feet barely touching the ground as they moved through the surreal landscape. The structures in the distance grew closer, their light pulsing in rhythm with the hum in the air. He felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if he had been here before, in a dream or a forgotten memory. As they walked, the figure spoke, its voice melodic and soothing. You have lived many lives, Ethan. Each one a lesson, a step on your journey. But this life, the one you left behind, is not yet complete. You have more to learn, more to do. Ethan frowned. But I died. I felt it. I saw my body. Your body is not who you are, the figure said. You are a soul, eternal and infinite. The body is merely a vessel, a tool for experience. But your journey is not yet over. Ethan's mind reeled. What happens now? The figure stopped and turned to him, its eyes filled with compassion. Now you see. The ground beneath them shifted, and suddenly, Ethan was standing in a vast circular chamber. The walls were made of what looked like mirrors, but instead of reflecting his image, they showed scenes from his life, moments of joy, pain, love, and regret. This is the Hall of Mirrors, the figure said. Here you will see your life as it truly was. Not as you remember it, but as others experienced it. Ethan stepped closer to one of the mirrors, his breath catching as he saw a scene from his childhood. He was a boy again, playing in the park with his father. But this time he saw it from his father's perspective. He felt the warmth of his father's love, the pride he felt as he watched his son laugh and play. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes as he moved to the next mirror. This one showed a moment from his wedding day. He saw himself standing at the altar, but this time he saw it through Claire's eyes. He felt her joy, her hope for the future, and the love she had for him. But as the scenes continued, the emotions became more complex. He saw arguments with Claire, moments of selfishness and neglect. He felt her pain, her loneliness, the way his words had cut her. He saw the way he had pushed people away, how he had buried himself in his work to avoid facing his own insecurities. I didn't realize, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know how much I hurt them. The figure placed a hand on his shoulder, or what felt like a hand. This is not meant to punish you, Ethan. It is meant to help you understand. You are more than your mistakes. You are more than your regrets. Ethan nodded, though the weight of his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He moved to the next mirror, and this time he saw a moment he had forgotten. It was a small act of kindness, helping a stranger carry their groceries. He felt the gratitude of the stranger, the warmth of their smile. I didn't think it mattered, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every act of kindness matters, the figure replied. Every moment of love, no matter how small, leaves a mark on the world. Ethan continued through the hall, each mirror showing a new scene, a new perspective. By the time he reached the end, he felt drained but also strangely at peace. He had seen the best and worst of himself, and though the regrets were painful, they were balanced by the moments of love and kindness. What happens now? Ethan asked, turning to the figure. Now, the figure said, you are ready to take the next step. The hall of mirrors dissolved around Ethan, the shimmering walls fading into a vast, ethereal landscape. The ground beneath his feet was soft and glowing, like walking on a sea of stars. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency, as if the very fabric of this place were alive. In the distance, a city of light rose from the horizon, its spires reaching into a sky that pulsed with colors Ethan couldn't name. But there was something else, a shadow dark and foreboding, lurking at the edge of his vision. It seemed to ripple and shift as if alive, and Ethan felt a chill run through him as he turned away. Where am I now? Ethan asked, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. You are in the Vale, a voice replied. Ethan turned and saw a figure approaching him. It was tall and radiant, its form shimmering with a light that seemed to come from within. Its face was serene, its eyes deep and knowing, and it moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly. I am Orion, the figure said, its voice melodic and soothing. A guide for those who find themselves here. The Vale. Ethan repeated, his mind struggling to grasp the concept. Is this the afterlife? Orion tilted its head, as if considering the question. The Vale is a place between life and death. It is a realm of transition, where souls come to reflect, to heal, and to prepare for what lies ahead. Ethan looked around, his heart pounding. Am I dead? Not yet, Orion replied. Your body clings to life, but your soul has journeyed here. This is a space where you can see clearly, where you can confront the truths you have avoided. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. What truths? Orion extended a hand, or something like a hand, toward him. Come. There is much for you to see. Ethan hesitated, then reached out. As his hand touched Orion's, a wave of energy surged through him, filling him with a sense of calm and clarity. They began to walk, the ground beneath them glowing softly with each step. As they moved, Ethan noticed others in the distance. Figures that seemed to flicker and fade, their forms indistinct. Some wandered aimlessly, their faces filled with confusion and sorrow. Others sat alone, their heads bowed as if weighed down by invisible burdens. Who are they? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They are lost souls, Orion replied. Souls who are unable to move forward. They are trapped by their regrets, their fears, their unresolved emotions. Ethan felt a pang of sadness as he watched them. Can't you help them? I can guide them, Orion said. But they must choose to let go of their pain. It is not an easy thing to do. As they walked, the city of light grew closer, its radiance almost blinding. Ethan felt a pull toward it, a sense of longing that he couldn't explain. But Orion stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You are not yet ready to enter the city, Orion said. There is something you must do first. What? Ethan asked, his heart pounding. You must confront your unresolved past, Orion replied. The veil is a place of reflection, Ethan. To move forward or to return, you must face the truths you have buried. Ethan frowned, his mind racing. What truths? Orion gestured toward the shadowy expanse in the distance. There you will find what you seek. But be warned, the journey will not be easy. The shadows feed on fear and regret. They will test you, challenge you. But if you can face them, you will find the clarity you need. Ethan looked at the shadow, his stomach churning. It seemed to pulse and writhe as if alive, and he felt a deep primal fear rising within him. Do I have to? He asked, his voice trembling. Orion's gaze was steady, filled with compassion. The choice is yours, Ethan. But know this, until you confront your past, you cannot move forward. You will remain here, like the lost souls you see around you. Ethan took a deep breath, or what felt like a breath, and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Orion placed a hand on his shoulder, its touch warm and reassuring. Remember, Ethan, you are not alone. I will be with you, even if you cannot see me. With that, Orion stepped back, its form dissolving into the light. Ethan was alone, standing at the edge of the shadowy expanse. The darkness seemed to stretch infinitely, its edges shifting and writhing like smoke. Ethan felt a chill run through him as he took a step forward, the ground beneath him growing colder with each step. As he moved deeper into the shadow, the air grew heavy, oppressive. The light from the city faded, replaced by a dim, eerie glow. Ethan's heart pounded as he walked, his senses on high alert. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct, like fragments of conversations just out of reach. But as he moved deeper, they grew louder, more insistent. You failed them, a voice hissed, cold and sharp. Ethan froze, his breath catching. Who's there? The voice laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. You know who we are, Ethan. We are your regrets, your fears, your doubts. We are the parts of yourself you tried to bury. Ethan turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. Shadows swirled around him, forming shapes that seemed almost human. He saw his father, his face filled with disappointment. He saw Claire, her eyes brimming with tears. He saw the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had missed. I'm sorry, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. But you did, the shadows hissed. You pushed them away. You buried yourself in your work. You chose pride over love. Ethan felt tears streaming down his face as the shadows closed in around him. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to be better. The shadows seemed to pause, their forms shifting and writhing. Do you want to be better? Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. Yes, I do. The shadows began to recede, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The whispers grew softer, fading into silence. And then Orion was there, its presence warm and reassuring. You faced them, Orion said, its voice filled with pride. That is no small thing. Ethan wiped his tears, his chest heaving. What happens now? Now, Orion replied. You are ready to move forward. The shadowy expanse dissolved, replaced by a series of vivid, haunting scenes. Ethan found himself standing in the middle of his childhood home, the air thick with the scent of his father's pipe tobacco. The walls were lined with photographs, smiling faces, birthday parties, holidays, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. This is your first trial, Orion's voice echoed in his mind, though the guide was nowhere to be seen. Confront what you have buried. Ethan's heart pounded as he saw his younger self, a boy of about 10, sitting at the kitchen table. His father stood nearby, his face stern, his arms crossed. You're not trying hard enough, Ethan, his father said, his voice sharp with disappointment. If you keep this up, you'll never amount to anything. Ethan felt a surge of anger and shame, emotions he had long suppressed. He wanted to scream to defend the boy he had been, but he was frozen, forced to watch as the scene unfolded. I'm doing my best, young Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Your best isn't good enough, his father snapped. You need to be better. The memory shifted, and Ethan was standing at his father's funeral. The room was filled with mourners, but Ethan felt nothing but numbness. He hadn't cried, hadn't allowed himself to feel the loss. Now, watching himself from the outside, he saw the pain in his own eyes, the regret he had buried deep. I'm sorry, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. I should have told you I loved you. I should have tried harder. The scene dissolved and Ethan found himself in a new memory. A small cafe. The air filled with the smell of coffee and pastries. Claire sat across from him, her eyes filled with tears. You're never here, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling. You're always working, always chasing some story. What about us? What about me? Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he watched himself respond, his voice cold and detached. I'm doing this for us, Claire. You know that. Do I? She shot back, her voice rising. Because it feels like you're doing this for yourself. Like you don't care about me at all. The memory shifted again, and Ethan was standing in a newsroom, surrounded by colleagues. He saw himself laughing, celebrating a big story he had broken. But in the corner of the room, a young intern sat alone, her face pale and shaken. Ethan remembered her. Sarah, a bright, eager journalist who had trusted him. He had used her for a source, exploiting her connections without considering the consequences. When the story blew up, she had been fired, her career ruined. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan whispered, his heart aching. I was so focused on the story I didn't think about the cost. The scene dissolved and Ethan found himself in a dark, empty space. The air was cold, the silence oppressive. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was him. The figure looked exactly like Ethan, but its eyes were cold, its expression filled with disdain. You're a failure, the figure said, its voice dripping with contempt. You hurt everyone who ever cared about you. You chased truth, but you destroyed lives in the process. Do you really think you deserve to move forward? Ethan felt a surge of fear and self-loathing, the words cutting deep. I didn't mean to, he stammered. Didn't you, the figure sneered. Or did you just not care? You were so focused on proving yourself, on being right, that you didn't stop to think about the damage you were causing. Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I didn't know how to be better. I didn't know how to fix it. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. And now it's too late. You'll never be enough, Ethan. You'll never be worthy of forgiveness. Ethan fell to his knees, the weight of the figure's words crushing him. He wanted to give up, to let the darkness consume him. But then a voice cut through the silence. Ethan. He looked up and saw Orion standing before him, its light piercing the darkness. Do not listen to the shadows, Orion said, its voice firm but gentle. They feed on your fear, your regret. But you are more than your mistakes. You are more than your pain. Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling. How can I move forward? How can I make up for what I've done? By accepting the truth, Orion replied. By forgiving yourself. You cannot change the past, Ethan, but you can learn from it. You can choose to be better. The figure of his darker self hissed, its form writhing and shifting. Don't listen to it, Ethan. You'll never be free of me. I am a part of you. Orion stepped forward, its light growing brighter. You are not alone, Ethan. You have the strength to face this. You have the power to choose. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He looked at the figure of his darker self, its eyes filled with malice, and felt a surge of determination. You're right, he said, his voice steady. You are a part of me. But you're not all of me. I've made mistakes, but I'm not defined by them. I can choose to be better. I can choose to move forward. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into the shadows. The darkness around Ethan began to recede, replaced by a soft golden light. Orion placed a hand on his shoulder, its touch warm and reassuring. You have faced your trials, Ethan. You have confronted your past. Now you are ready to move forward. Ethan nodded, his heart filled with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. What happens now? Now, Orion said, you must choose. You can return to your life, to the world you left behind. Or you can move forward into the light. Ethan looked toward the city of light, its spires glowing in the distance. He felt a pull toward it, a sense of belonging. But he also thought of Claire, of the life he had left behind. I need to go back, he said, his voice filled with resolve. I need to make things right. Orion nodded, its expression filled with pride. Then go, Ethan. But remember what you have learned. Carry it with you and let it guide you. The light around Ethan grew brighter, filling his vision. He felt a surge of energy, a sense of purpose. And then everything went white. The light around Ethan dimmed, and he found himself standing in a vast open space. The ground beneath him was soft and glowing, like a field of stars, and the air hummed with a low resonant frequency. Orion stood beside him, its form radiant and serene. You have faced your trials, Ethan, Orion said, its voice filled with warmth. Now you must make a choice. Ethan frowned, his heart pounding. What kind of choice? Orion gestured toward the horizon, where two paths stretched out before them. One led toward the city of light, its spires glowing with an otherworldly brilliance. The other path led back into the shadows, toward a faint, flickering light that seemed to pulse with life. The first path, Orion explained, leads to the city of light. There, you will find peace and understanding. You will learn the mysteries of the universe. And you will be free from the pain and regret of your mortal life. Ethan felt a pull toward the city, a sense of longing that was almost overwhelming. But then Orion gestured to the second path. The second path leads back to your life. You will return to the world you left behind, but you will not be the same. You will carry the knowledge you have gained here. And you will have the chance to make amends, to live a life of purpose and meaning. Ethan's mind raced as he looked between the two paths. The city of light called to him, its promise of peace and understanding almost irresistible. But he also thought of Claire, of his mother, of his younger brother. Those who were waiting for him, those he had left behind. What happens if I choose the city? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Orion's gaze was steady, filled with compassion. If you choose the city, your journey in the mortal world will end. You will move on, leaving behind the life you knew. But you will find peace, and you will be free. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart aching. And if I choose to go back? If you choose to return, you will have the chance to live again, Orion replied. But it will not be easy. You will carry the weight of what you have learned here. And you will face challenges and struggles. But you will also have the chance to make a difference, to live a life of purpose and meaning. Ethan felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked toward the city of light. It was beautiful, radiant, and he felt a deep longing to be a part of it. But then he thought of Claire, of the love they had shared, of the pain he had caused her. He thought of his mother, who had always believed in him, and his younger brother, who had looked up to him. I don't know what to do, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. Orion placed a hand on his shoulder, its touch warm and reassuring. The choice is yours, Ethan. But know this, you are not alone. Whatever you choose, you will be guided and supported. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind filled with images of his life, the good and the bad, the joy and the pain. He thought of the people he had loved, the people he had hurt, and the people who had loved him in return. And then he felt a surge of clarity. I need to go back, he said, his voice filled with resolve. I need to make things right. My purpose isn't over yet. Orion nodded, its expression filled with pride. Then go, Ethan. But before you do, there is one more thing you must see. The light around them shifted, and Ethan found himself standing in a vast, ethereal library. The walls were lined with glowing orbs, each one pulsing with a soft golden light. This is the Great Library, Orion explained. Here, the secrets of existence are stored. Every soul that passes through this realm contributes to its knowledge. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against one of the orbs. Instantly, a flood of images and sensations filled his mind. Memories, emotions, and insights that weren't his own. He saw the life of a woman who had lived centuries ago. Her joys and sorrows, her triumphs and regrets. Time is not linear in this realm, Orion said. Past, present, and future are all connected. Every life, every experience is part of a greater whole. Ethan pulled his hand away, his mind reeling. What does this mean? It means that your life, your choices, are part of something much larger, Orion replied. Every act of kindness, every moment of love, leaves a mark on the world. And every soul has a purpose, a role to play in the grand tapestry of existence. Ethan felt a surge of awe as he looked around the library. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming but also comforting. He was part of something greater, something eternal. I understand, he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Orion placed a hand on his shoulder, its touch warm and reassuring. Then you are ready to return. The light around Ethan grew brighter, filling his vision. He felt a surge of energy, a sense of purpose. And then everything went white. Ethan's eyes snapped open, and he gasped for air as if he'd been drowning. The world rushed back in a cacophony of sound. Beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and the sharp antiseptic smell of a hospital. Bright lights burned his eyes and he winced, raising a hand to shield his face. He's awake, a voice shouted, and suddenly there were people around him, their faces blurry but their urgency palpable. Mr. Carter, can you hear me? A woman in a white coat asked, leaning over him. Her voice was calm but firm, her hands moving quickly as she checked the monitors beside his bed. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat felt like it had been stuffed with sandpaper. He managed a weak nod, his mind still reeling from the transition. One moment he had been in the Great Library surrounded by the secrets of existence, and the next he was here back in his body, back in the mortal world. You've been in a coma for 3 days, the doctor said, her tone softening slightly. You're lucky to be alive. The accident was severe. The accident. The bus. The rain. It all came flooding back. The screech of tires, the impact, the out-of-body experience. Ethan's heart raced as he remembered the things he'd seen, the things he'd learned. It hadn't been a dream. It couldn't have been. I died, he croaked, his voice barely audible. The doctor exchanged a glance with a nurse before responding. Your heart stopped briefly, but we were able to revive you. What you experienced was likely a hallucination caused by trauma and lack of oxygen to the brain. Ethan shook his head weakly. No, it was real. I was there. I saw. But the doctor was already turning away, her attention shifting to the monitors. Rest now, Mr. Carter. We'll discuss this later. As the medical team bustled around him, Ethan closed his eyes, trying to process what had happened. But something was different. Even with his eyes closed, he could sense the energy in the room, the steady pulse of the machines, the faint glow of the lights, the warmth of the people around him. It was as if his senses had been dialed up to 11, as if he could feel the world in a way he never had before. And then there were the whispers. At first he thought it was his imagination, but as the room quieted, he realized he could hear them, soft, indistinct voices, like fragments of conversations just out of reach. They weren't coming from the people in the room. They were coming from somewhere else, somewhere beyond. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice trembling. The nurse paused, glancing at him with a puzzled expression. Hear what, Mr. Carter? The voices, he said, his heart pounding. They're everywhere. The nurse gave him a sympathetic smile. It's probably just the medication. Try to rest. But Ethan knew it wasn't the medication. Something had changed in him, something fundamental. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air seemed to hum around him. He had been to the other side, and he had brought something back with him. The days that followed were a blur of tests, questions, and restless nights. Claire visited him, her face a mix of relief and anger. You scared me half to death, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I'd lost you. Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her emotions too raw to bridge the gap between them. He wanted to tell her everything, about the Hall of Mirrors, the City of Light, the shadow beings, but he knew she wouldn't believe him. How could she? He barely believed it himself, and he had lived it. When he was finally discharged, Ethan returned to a life that no longer felt like his own. The flat he shared with Claire felt cold and empty, a shell of what it had once been. He tried to go back to work, to write the article about Dr. Hart's research, but the words wouldn't come. How could he write about near-death experiences as if they were just another scientific curiosity when he had lived one? A week after his release, Ethan quit his job. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "You've worked so hard to build your career. You can't just throw it all away." "I'm not throwing it away," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. I need to figure things out. There's something bigger going on, Claire. Something I can't ignore." Claire shook her head, her eyes filled with disappointment. "I don't know who you are anymore." Neither did Ethan. As the weeks passed, he threw himself into researching near-death experiences, poring over books, articles, and first-hand accounts. He reached out to Dr. Hart, who listened to his story with a mix of fascination and skepticism. "What you're describing aligns with many other accounts," she said. "But the things you're experiencing now, the heightened senses, the voices, that's unusual. It's possible that your brain is still processing the trauma." But Ethan knew it was more than that. He could see things now, auras around people, faint glows that shifted with their emotions. He could sense when something was about to happen, a strange tingling in his chest that warned him of danger or opportunity. And the whispers, they were always there, a constant reminder of the world beyond. One night, as he sat alone in the flat, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He closed his eyes, focusing on them, and suddenly he heard a voice, clear and distinct. "You were sent back for a reason." Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. "Who's there?" But the room was empty. The voice had come from somewhere else, somewhere beyond. It was then that Ethan realized the truth. He hadn't returned by accident. He had been sent back, to warn humanity about the darkness he had seen, to help others avoid the fate of the lost souls.